So I could not help but be struck as I read this text that the world of Athens is so much like the contemporary world we live in today. Our story begins at telling us Paul was distressed to see a city full of idols. Now, in Athens at that time, there were lots of statues, lots of temples, lots of likenesses where the different gods in their pantheon could be worshipped, from Zeus to Mercury to Dionysus to Athena, the namesake for the city. And these idols were prolific, always around them, these idols, images of representations of a god used as an object of worship. Now, I must confess, I find the Athenians a rather practical and pragmatic people who worshiped and revered and sacrificed to those gods who'd cover all their bases, right? To get what they want and desired. After all, what good is a god if you cannot sacrifice to them and have a successful and prosperous life? And while I could not point to any statues or idols of Mercury or Zeus, to any idols like that in our world today, we certainly have our own city full of idols. Last week, I asked the Sunday school class, when they looked at this text, I asked them, what idols do we worship today? And I think it was surprisingly easy to identify a number of those idols that get our attention. All we have to do is see the idol of wealth, the temples of banks practically at every corner of our city, right? Think about it, almost more banks than we have churches, right? Or one has only to think of the idols of celebrity, revered for their success in acting or sports, or sometimes for nothing more than making a TikTok. Or the new idols of social influencers who are lifted up and celebrated by what? By, I find this ironic, by a number of followers. On Twitter, on Instagram. We even have a show, right? Titled American Idol. And then there are the particular idols of our own particular tribes, whether that tribe be nationalism or political party or even a political leader or social class. I was struck, Amgad preached a couple of weeks ago and opened his sermon when he shared these studies that indicated, if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's really insightful. The studies indicate that people really shape their worldview, their morals, their sense of what's self and what's right. They shape that all rooted not in their religious belief, but in their political ideology, more than anything else. I think we are like the Athenians, a practical and pragmatic people covering our bases to cover as many idols as we can revere. We live, much like Athens, in a city full of idols. And we are divided by the particular idols we owe allegiance to. They are what we create, the images and representations used as objects of worship. Idols are those things that we invest our time in, our energy, our resources, reflecting what we value, and in many ways reflecting, one might say, our own selves. Recently, I read a quote while I was spending time at the temple of Facebook, which now is going to start calling Meta for metaverse. Talk about an idol. The quote went something like this, and I love this quote. If your God looks like you, thinks like you, loves the same people as you, and hates the same people as you, then your God is yourself. So Paul begins to preach in this city of idols, and immediately he causes a stir. And I love that line. I heard some folks laugh, that line in which they call him a pretentious babbler, which I always hope I don't hear on Sunday mornings after I preach. So, pretentious babbler. He points out, and it's interesting what he points out at the beginning. He points out they're always into something new. They're always paying attention to the new thing, the new and improved. Now, does that sound familiar? Well, and they could be described. Paul says, you could be described as spiritual, but not religious. Does that sound familiar? And then he begins his message. And what strikes me about the beginning of Paul's message is that he begins it not with condemnation, but with affirmation. He defines his faith and connects to these people not by saying what he is against, but by what he is for. Now, this is important in the world in which we live in, a very divided world in which we worship different idols and gods. It's important in a number of ways for us. More often, if you think about it, and I think if we reflect on it, more often than not, we define what we believe and who we are by what we are against, right? I'm against this policy, or I'm against this ideology, or I'm against this political program, rather than saying what we are for. I must confess that more often than not, now this is a true confession, more often than not, I'm defined by what I oppose than by what I propose. And so Paul, pointing to this altar of the unknown God, Paul shows a different kind of strategy, intended to connect, not to alienate. He starts where they are. Now, I have read a number of educators, a number of people who reflect on these things, point out that this is really important. That especially when you're discussing with someone in which you have very strong differences, maybe you're discussing some controversial and divisive issues, with someone we may vehemently disagree with. And they will tell you, start with what you have in common, with what you agree on, what you might value together. That's the point in space and a point in a place where we stand together and start there and not apart. After all, one might say, when all is said and done, we most likely are more alike than we are different. So pointing to this altar, to an unknown God, Paul affirms, he proclaims, he proposes this universalist message that the God pointed to in that unknown God is the very God who made everyone. All humanity. God made us all. Now, it doesn't sound anything radical to say, but in that time and place, that is what he proclaims. That this God gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. Not ultimately that we are defined by the particular idols we worship, that we are defined as being Athenian or Jew, not that we are defined as American or Russian, not defined one way or another, but all people, all of God's people are created by the grace of God who gifted us life in this world we live in. he emphasizes our commonality, what we hold in common. Now, this God who doesn't live in shrines made by human hands or human egos, this God is not served by human hands or human egos as if, he says, God needed anything from us. From one ancestor, he says, he made all peoples to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence, the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that, and I love how he puts it, so that even as they would search for God, perhaps, as he puts it, fumble about for God and try to find God, even though God is not far from us. For in God we live and move and have our being, as if, even as they say some of our poets have said, for we too are God's offspring. I love that universal description of humanity is fumbling about, right, for God, for whatever. Maybe that's why we worship so many idols. We're trying to find something that fills our lives, gives meaning to it, whether that's American Idol or whether that's a political party or a political leader. We're always fumbling about for that essence. Augustine, in the 4th century, one of the great church theologians, he once wrote, he says, in every human being, universally in every human being, is this great, big, God-shaped hole that can only be filled with the one true God. And we might fill it with all kinds of things, all kinds of desires, all kinds of addictions, all kinds of things. In fact, we are always fumbling around. If we had to describe one thing that humans share in common, Paul has it right. We're a bunch of fumblers, right? Just trying our best. And yet, he points out, and I think we forget this so easily as we worship the particular idols we worship, how God is not far from each of us. Now, I need that good word these days, in part because I don't know about you, but the world certainly feels like God's pretty far away, right? These days. But Paul's right, God is not far away, for in God we live, we move, and we have our being. We just forget that. Now, I know many of you are sick of my stories from hiking in Glacier National Park. I know my kids are. They claim I always am telling them stories from Glacier National Park and the hiking. And in part because it was so meaningful for me, and in many ways, in part because it was a sense in which I kind of, the things that would normally fill my life, the things that would normally have my attention, the things that normally I would be paying attention to, I couldn't have in the mountains, right? God help me, I almost panicked when I didn't have cell service. Or I couldn't watch a TV. Or I couldn't do the things that I normally could do. In some ways, the idols are stripped away. But really what made it most profound is that in that place of creation, in the mountains and forest, sky and sun and clouds, somehow, and I think we all can relate to this experience, we truly, deeply had a sense of our connection to it all. Of the bigness, the hugeness of God, the profoundness of the beauty around us, so that one maybe stops and just simply experiences moving and having our being in God. And I bet every single one of you in here could tell a story, whether you were at the base of the Grand Canyon or whether you were at a beach in the vastness of the ocean or whether you too were hiking through the mountains. It is then that we truly understand our connectedness in the God who created us, in the world around us, that same God who gifted it. Not because we served God, because the nature of God is grace. When you're in the mountains or at the beach or the Grand Canyon, it's hard to forget that. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.